Hey guys, I'm John and welcome to Respect Your Intellect. Today we'll be doing part 4 of our follow-up to the answers that were offered by Flat Earther Phuket Word in response to my 20 questions video. Let's get started. If you haven't watched the first 3 parts of this follow-up, you should go check those out first. If you're up to date with where we were, let's do a quick recap of the results up to now. We're at 5 questions completely avoided and unanswered, 2 questions that admit not knowing the answer, 7 questions where the answer is completely wrong, and 1 question where he correctly agreed with science. So in total, the score is 1 out of 15 up to now for a total score of 6.7%. This is the last chance for it to get any better, so let's see what happens. Question 5. How do you explain seasons and how they're inversed in each hemisphere? His answer? He starts off by saying he doesn't subscribe to the flat earth map. We've already covered this in a previous part in this series and established that he really doesn't have a map at all in a world where we now have over 100,000 flights every single day that navigate using the globe. That should pretty much speak for itself in my opinion, so let's move on. Then he says to look into zetetic astronomy and that it's perfectly good. Well, if that's the case, he should start making predictions with it and revolutionizing science. If you can't make predictions, then it's not science and should be discarded as false. After that, he talks about the sun having a corkscrew motion that gives seasons, narrower and wider light, a difference in heat, and that the firmament acting like a magnifying glass also changes the heat at the focal point. Alright, so first, the corkscrew motion would not account for seasons because as it would gain or lose elevation, all parts of the world would experience the same seasons. A higher sun would make it winter everywhere, and lower would be summer everywhere, so it doesn't explain the opposite seasons on each side of the equator. As for the width of the spotlight he mentions, then a higher sun would make it winter with a bigger spotlight, and that's the opposite of the shorter days we experience during winter. I'll just skip over the rest of this point because we can already see that this answer doesn't make any sense. Then he says we can't measure or observe the tilt of the Earth, and again says that school books say it's just an interpretation that's never been proven. We already covered how much of a lie this is, but I'll say it again since it's short. We have the tilt measured pretty accurately since 1100 BC, which is over 3,000 years ago, and it was refined in ancient Greece around 350 BC. The full explanation was in part 1 if you want to go check that out in more detail. He continues by saying he sees the same stars at the same time every day of the year at the equator and that it debunks the globe. I'm not entirely sure what his point is here because our rotation doesn't really affect the stars we see. It's our orbit around the sun that would have a small impact here. Even if you take into account the 186 million miles or so from 2 extreme opposites of our orbit, that's still a minuscule distance when it comes to the cosmos. This distance allows us to see very small changes in the stars that we use as stellar parallax for measuring distances, and only works for stars within 100 parsecs of the Earth. These changes are not typically things you can notice without instruments helping you compare positions against the more distant background stars that show no movement. As for the time he mentions, he's at the equator, so it's normal that he's pretty much getting 12-hour days and 12-hour nights pretty much year-round. Nothing he says here debunks the globe in any way, so don't pay attention to that. Then he says the rotation of the Earth would end up with opposite day and night 6 months later. What he's not realizing here is that we calculate days from solar noon to solar noon, which is a bit more than a full rotation of the Earth. The simple rotation of the Earth on its own axis is what we call a sidereal day, and it's 4 minutes shorter than a solar day. If we calculated our days based on the sidereal days, then yes, we would have opposite days and nights 6 months apart. But since we calculate based on solar days, we're always facing the sun at noon due to the extra 4 minutes of rotation we have every day. Then he says he experiences mild seasons at the equator and sunrises and sunsets vary slightly. So that's normal as well since the equator receives the same amount of sunlight year-round. If you're slightly off of the equator like he is in Thailand, then there will only be a slight change in overall temperature and humidity. Since the change in weather is so small there, they don't really use our seasons like spring, summer, fall, and winter. Instead, they use hot, cool, and wet for their season since that's more helpful in that part of the world near the equator. After that, he says the North Star just doesn't move. He's forgetting that our North Star was Thuban a few thousand years ago until 3000 BC, and in 13,000 years it'll be Vega. Many others will be used in between those, but their luminosities are not all that great. The brightest North Star we ever get in the cycle is Vega, and that's repeated in 25,772 year cycles. This cycle is our axis of rotation that rotates in circles, a bit like a straw circling the edge of a glass. Finally, he says the heliocentric model says that wintertime is when we're closer to the sun and summer is when we're farther away. I'm not entirely sure what he's saying here because the seasons are related to our tilt and not the position in our orbit or how close we are to the sun. At any point in time, both summer and winter are experienced simultaneously on the planet. It just depends which hemisphere you're in. The hemisphere that receives more sunlight is experiencing summer, while the other half is experiencing winter. The distance to the sun only changes by plus or minus 1.7% throughout the year, and that doesn't change much at all to the amount of energy we receive from it. What makes us comfortable on the planet is not the direct sunlight we receive, but rather the heat we trap inside our atmosphere from the total sun rays we receive. While the total amount of sun rays we receive as a planet doesn't change much at all during the year as our distance to the sun changes, the amount of sun rays that the individual hemispheres receive are enough to be responsible for our seasons. Analysis? The only things he offered as an answer here are zetetic astronomy and his corkscrew motion of the sun. Neither of those can make predictions, and the corkscrew motion doesn't agree with reality since winter days are shorter, not longer. Score? Fail. This answer was just plain wrong. Question 4. Why is the moon scarred with impact craters all over its surface? His answer? He says we assume that they're craters, but if you analyze them closely, they have a nipple in the center. Well, let's start by getting the terms correct. It's not a nipple, it's called a central peak. Here's a small demonstration of an iron ball falling in sand. As you can see here, when the ball hits the sand, it briefly acts a bit like water and forms a high central peak. Then you can see here that the ball also rebounds back up a bit to near the surface to form a bump. This is just an example though, and not all impacts behave exactly this way. There are also other factors to take into account for real impacts like transfer of heat, melting, and vaporizing. For a more accurate study of crater formation, it's best done with explosives rather than displacement, since an explosion is more closely related to an actual impact like we're talking about here. As far as central peaks go, conditions don't always allow them to form, and the acceleration due to gravity has a big role to play in this process. With a small object size or speed, impact craters will lack a central peak. With a slightly bigger object size or speed, impact craters will have a central peak and are known as complex craters. With an even bigger object or even higher speed, impact craters will have an internal ring instead of a central peak, and those are known as peak ring craters. This is also why the more gravity there is, the less diameter you need for the crater to have a central peak, because the object doesn't have to be as big if it's moving faster. Then he asked if the impact flashes are proven to actually be impacts. Yes, they're definitely proven because they happen every few hours. Many of them are very dim and only last a fraction of a second, so they're hard to catch, but that's why a lot of amateur astronomers watch for them because they enjoy the challenge. These impact flashes are also documented to have briefly lit up dark parts of the moon for at least 1,000 years. More recently, since 2005, we've documented impacts that we've recorded by video, and many of those are associated with meteor showers. So this is a well-established fact that we have a substantial amount of knowledge on, and it correlates perfectly well with other events that we can observe. Then he says all impact craters, if that's what they are all hitting straight on and no angle. No, they're not. They can hit from all different types of angles. This is complex math, so I'll put a link in the description to a post that someone did that goes through all the math. Essentially, even a 45-degree angle will create a very slight ellipse shape that will be too subtle for your eyes to realize that it's not a perfect circle. Furthermore, the space debris is being pulled towards the center of mass when it comes close, not towards the surface. So the path of the debris will tend to want to straighten out if it's not already headed directly towards the center of mass. Then he talks about the electric universe model where those impact craters could be charges of plasma hitting the moon. Well, we've already covered exactly what the craters are and how they form, so I'll just skip this electric universe reference that disagrees with all of science completely. Then he talks again about his concave moon and how it's like a concave mass that appears to keep eye contact with you. So this is just pulling at straws again and doesn't even deserve to be responded to. He himself said it was a ridiculous idea before. Then he continues by saying that we always see the same features on the moon and that since it's smaller than Earth, we should be able to see more or less of one side or another of it from different locations on Earth. The Earth is 7,900 miles in diameter, while the moon is 2,150 miles in diameter and 240,000 miles away, and it's tidally locked to the Earth, so we always see the same side. Even moving from one side of the Earth to the other, this 7,900 miles won't allow us to see much more of the moon because we're so far away. But essentially, if you take that into account as well as the phases of the moon and all the movements, we see about 59% of the moon in total, which is slightly over half of it. So perhaps this alone answers this question, but let's look at an easy example to reproduce with the correct ratios. Take a basketball to represent the Earth and place a tennis ball 23.5 feet away to represent the moon and its distance from the Earth. Then look from directly behind the left side and the right side of the basketball towards the tennis ball and see how much more of the tennis ball you see. It'll be a bit more than half and pretty close to the 59% we see of the moon, though there's a few things we didn't account for here, like the moon's orbit and other movements. He continues by saying there's no way to tell if the moon is actually a sphere whatsoever. While we could literally see our beards grow while listing all the ways in which we know it's a sphere, so I'll just skip over this one considering how much information we already went over. Finally, he asks why debris doesn't end up in the moon's orbit instead of hitting it. It can, but the moon's gravity field varies by about 1% due to mascons. Mascon stands for mass concentration and represents part of a planet or a moon that has a higher mass for one reason or another, like meteor impacts or dense lava flows. For example, the moon's center of mass is not in its geometric center, but about 2 kilometers off of it in the direction of the Earth. Because of this variation in the gravity field of the moon, it's extremely difficult to orbit it for long periods of time. Most things that end up orbiting it can only last a few decades at the most. Analysis? He didn't actually offer an answer here. He just seemed to have a bunch of hypotheses that don't work and didn't make any of them his actual answer. He basically just asked for so many things that this question just turned into a lesson in astronomy. Score? Fail. He avoided the question. Question 3. How is the direct Qantas Flight 27 from Sydney, Australia to Santiago, Chile possible in 12 hours? His answer? He starts off by saying he doesn't subscribe to the Flat Earth map. He could probably have left it at that, but instead he'll be defending the Flat Earth map in just a second. So he continues by pulling up 2 Flat Earth maps and says you can do just a slight curve to not go over the Americas to get to the destination. So I guess he wasn't paying attention to the question itself, where I wrote on the illustration that even a straight path was longer than the max range of that aircraft. Adding a slight curve to that would make it longer than a straight line and would not be possible. Not to mention that it would also not agree with real-world observations made during the flight either. Analysis? The question was asking how this flight is possible in 12 hours, and his answer, on top of being impossible, would not allow the flight to be completed in only 12 hours. Score? Fail. His answer was just completely wrong. Question 2. How can mountains cast shadow on clouds? His answer? He starts by saying it only happens in a specific time of year in the winter with very low clouds at sunrise and snow on the mountain that's reflected upwards to create the shadow. So first, this happens during fall and winter, so I wouldn't exactly call half the year a rare occurrence. But yes, it does require the clouds to be at the correct altitude range to catch the shadow, so it doesn't happen every morning. As far as his snow reflection argument goes, I'm not exactly sure what he's trying to say, but if snow was the reason, then this phenomenon could be seen on all mountains, especially this one, all year. Yet only a few mountains can actually do this, so snow has nothing to do with it. Then he says it's just about the only place in the world we can see this phenomenon, and only at a specific time of year in specific conditions, and that it's cherry picking. No, it's not cherry picking, it's a phenomenon that requires an explanation regardless of how often it happens, because the fact is that it does happen. Also, Mount Hood is another mountain that does this, but the fact remains that you need a very flat and unobstructed ground level, and those are rare around mountains. A very leveled ground is what allows light to travel very close to the ground and continue in an upwards path to the mountain. And finally, he says shadows expand, so the light only has to go up slightly and expand slightly to cast a shadow on the bottom of the clouds. So this seems to me like he's agreeing that sunlight is coming from lower than the mountain and that the light is traveling upwards. I'm not sure if he's aware that this falsifies his model yet again. Analysis? He seemed to agree that the sun is below the mountain peak, but we can't give him a pass if he doesn't explain to us how it works on a flat earth that claims the sun is always much higher than the clouds. A local sun being lower than the mountain peak would mean that we can easily fly above the sun, yet it never happens. It also probably means we would burn alive from the proximity and all the land would likely be scorched to ashes. Score? Fail. There's really no scenario where a local sun being below the clouds on a flat plane is plausible, and he hasn't offered any explanation to help anyway. Question 1. How can clouds be illuminated from below during sunrises and sunsets? His answer? He says it's just the very light clouds that allow the light to pass through them that changes their color and only appears to be the bottom side, while the denser clouds don't allow the light to pass through them at all. This is an extremely weak argument, and the videos I supplied with the question exhibit none of the behaviors he's claiming. If the clouds were allowing light to pass through, then these clouds would be illuminated from the top even more than the bottom, and that's not at all what we see with the clouds that we have a side view of. You can also see in this video that when the sun actually moves above the clouds, there's barely any light passing through anymore. Yet, the clouds stayed pretty similar throughout the entire video. This alone falsifies his argument. Then he says that things like sand, snow, and ice reflect light as well, and that he's done videos on this, and that it's easy for anyone to observe and figure out for themselves. Well, they do reflect light, but they're not mirrors, so the intensity of the reflected light is never as bright as the sun itself. Even if the ground was a mirror and the sun was above the clouds, you would still never be able to keep the top of the clouds in shade, since the light source shines directly on top if it's above. After that, he says that light doesn't come from one direction, it's omnipresent, and that the idea that light travels in parallel lines is ridiculous. I think he means straight lines here rather than parallel. And what's ridiculous is his denial of the straight path of light that anyone can observe with a laser. Even when there's a medium in the way that refracts the light and changes its angle, as soon as it comes back out, it's back to being parallel to what it was before it entered the medium. Also, if light was omnipresent, shadows would not exist, since shadows are essentially an absence of light, so he's just saying complete nonsense here. He continues by saying that even if the sun is higher, it also gets further away, so the clouds appearing to hit the horizon will block the light even if they're below the sun. He also says it's very simple to explain sunsets that way. While it is very simple when you don't deny the globe, because that's exactly what's happening, but this isn't how we describe a sunset, it's how we describe shade. In reality, clouds at a distance can seem to touch the horizon from your point of view because of the curvature of the earth. With clouds that low at the horizon, it's entirely possible for them to block sunlight from getting to you if the sun is also near the horizon, because the sun is way behind the clouds. This would illuminate the top of the clouds though, not the bottom, so it doesn't help him answer the question at all. And finally, he says we have to make a lot of assumptions to claim that it's actually the sun lighting up the bottom side of the clouds. There are no assumptions here. We see where the sunlight originates from by looking at the brightest area, which is from the horizon or even a bit below it. We also have many profile views of clouds where it's clear that the top is in shade while the bottom is illuminated. Flat earthers like to preach to trust your senses, but they're really quick at denying what their eyes see if it doesn't please them. Analysis? His main answer here is that the light is able to pass through the clouds so we can see light from below, but we've already seen how this doesn't work because the top of the cloud would be even brighter than the bottom if that was the case. Score? Fail. His answer was just plain wrong. So this concludes all of the answers, but I have one more thing to add before we get to the final score. In the outro of the original video, I also asked a couple of questions to flat earthers to try and make them think about their position. I asked if it was tiresome for them to always hear illogical answers from people in their movement. I also asked if they found it annoying that people in their movement are incredibly inconsistent. Then I asked if it was exhausting to have to deny absolutely everything around them. And finally, finally, I ended by asking if they thought it was more likely that their experiments are faulty, that they were fed misinformation, or that they jumped too quickly to conclusions rather than the entirety of science being wrong throughout thousands of years of history. So if you guys want me to cover the answers he gave for that as a bonus to this series, give this video a like. If this video gets to 1,000 likes in the first 2 days, I'll cover the answers he gave to these questions as a bonus part to this series. Without the likes, I'll probably move on to other stuff because quite frankly, it's not an easy task to listen to this much nonsense. And now for the final score. We have 7 questions completely avoided and unanswered, 2 questions that admits not knowing the answer, 10 questions where the answer is completely wrong, and 1 question where he had correctly agreed with science. So the final score stands at a whopping 5%. In other words, this is a mere 1/12 of a barely passing grade, so it probably qualifies as an epic fail. It should also be noted that he did not supply an answer for 9 of the 20 questions, which is almost half of them. When he started at the very beginning, he was saying that this was repetitive and tedious, as if he had all the answers. I guess we know now that that was just another bold-faced lie. The last thing I want to mention is that a lot of other flat earthers also sent in their own answers. So to those people, I need to say that I spend I don't know how many hours reading through them, and I just had to stop at some point. Most of the answers that were given were just about as bad as Phuket offered here. They were just perhaps a little bit less perspective oriented. There's simply nothing I saw that can withstand even a tiny bit of scrutiny as far as answers to these 20 questions, which is essentially how I came up with them in the first place. They were meant to be hard for a flat earth model to explain while still being very simple if you accept reality. So thanks to everyone who followed the entire series and or participated, and don't forget to hit the like button if you want to see the additional bonus part that covers the outro questions. Also, don't hesitate to subscribe if you enjoyed it. You can also find the links in the description for my Twitter and Facebook if you want to interact with me there. Until next time, thanks for watching, and remember, respect your intellect.